This video aims to answer a few major questions in Christianity. Is penal substitutionary atonement biblical? If so, did Jesus go to hell for 3 days? What is the mechanism of our salvation? Is eternal security, or once saved, always saved, biblical? And lastly, why do believers still die if Jesus' sacrifice covers all the sins of believers? So let's get right to it. First thing I want to do is clear up the idea of hell. Revelation 20, verse 12 to 15 says, "And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books, according to what they had done. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them. And they were judged, each one of them according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire." So you may have noticed all the dead people are either around the throne, in the sea, or in death and Hades. They're not in hell. And it is at the end when the realms of under the earth will be thrown into the lake of fire and repurposed to become the final hell where non-believers end up. Thus, since hell doesn't exist yet, Jesus couldn't have gone to hell for 3 days. Instead, Jesus went to under the earth. This is evident by Acts 2, verse 27, which says, "For you will not abandon my soul to Hades, or let your Holy One see corruption." Peter is quoting Psalm 16:10. It is David talking in the psalm, but David died, was buried, and still remains in his tomb. Thus, Peter concludes that this psalm is about Jesus and his resurrection. This implies that Jesus did in fact go into Hades temporarily. Now the question becomes, what is Hades, or under the earth? In the story of Lazarus and the rich man, we can see that both of them are technically in the same general location since the rich man could see Lazarus. However, there's a great chasm that divides a realm where one side has a suffering people and one side is like a paradise. But depending on who you ask, the sea is where the suffering happens because the sea represents chaos and judgment. But that doesn't matter too much for our discussion because the chasm could just be the division between under the earth and the sea. So, did Jesus have to go to the suffering side of Hades or the sea to pay for the sins of humanity? Nope. But then how could Jesus have paid for the sins of the world if he didn't go to hell or at least to the suffering side of the realm of the dead? Isn't hell the punishment for sins? It is. Then wouldn't Jesus have had to go to hell to take our punishment? Nope. Hell is punishment for people who could not completely pay off their outstanding payments for their sins. But Jesus did not have to go to hell or the suffering side of the realm of the dead to pay for the sins of the people because his bodily death was enough to pay for the sins. To make this make sense, I will discuss the differences between sinner's death and Jesus' death. A sinner's death cannot be used to pay for sins because sinners' deaths are completely worthless when it comes to the power to pay for sins. And another way to think about it is that sinners' lives are corrupt. And think about this, what good is blood money to a perfectly just and good judge? Would a judge like that allow payment with such money? Even the animal sacrifices needed to have no blemishes to be acceptable by God. Which is why non-believers suffer the second death, where they are eternally separated from God as a punishment for their outstanding payment. And not even the sentence carried out in hell can pay for the sins, since even the time of a sinner is worthless when it comes to paying for sins. Now, contrast that with Jesus' death and sacrifice. Jesus lived a perfect life free of sins, which is why his death had the power to pay for sins. And because he never sinned, he wasn't meant to die, which means his death could be used to pay for others. That means, unlike sinners' deaths, his death is valuable. And Jesus' death was infinitely valuable because Jesus is God, which adds to the reason why his bodily death was enough without Jesus needing to suffer after death to completely pay off the payment for sins. However, does this really mean Jesus took on our punishment, like what the penal substitutionary atonement is about? Well, let's take a look at the prayer at Gethsemane, which can be found in Matthew chapter 26. Matthew 26:39 says, "And going a little further, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, 'My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will.'" That cup Jesus was talking about is the cup of wrath. The cup of wrath is filled as people sin, and God will eventually pour it out on the people. And that cup is the judgment that people have to face. However, by Jesus saying he was going to take the cup, it meant that he was going to take the judgment on himself with his own life. There are also other parts of the Bible, like in Isaiah 53, where it says, "He was pierced for our transgression, he was crushed for our iniquities." And if that's not enough, the concept of paying for sins can be found in Mark 10, where it says Jesus came to give his life as a ransom for many. The word for ransom means the price of release. It is a very precise legal and financial term used in the slave market or prisoner of war to release someone. And we can't forget the famous part in Romans 6 saying the wages of sin is death. Jesus did not sin, so his death was not for himself, which means his death was for the sins of others. Finally, the strongest biblical evidence. In Colossians 2, verses 13 to 14, it says, "And you who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us of our trespasses, by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross." This means that the payment was made at the cross. All these together show that at least two of the purposes of Jesus' sacrifice was receiving the judgment in the place of sinners to pay for their sins. Now, here is a crucial question for our discussion about eternal salvation. When exactly does Jesus' payment get applied to a believer? It happens at the moment of believing in Jesus. Romans 4 verses 3 to 5 says, "For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Now, to the one who works, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as his due. And to the one who does not work but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness." But what does becoming righteous mean? In a previous video about 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 21, I explained that righteousness comes because of sins being all paid for. Think about it. Could you stand in front of a person with a clear conscience while owing him money but not being able to pay it back or just deciding not to? Of course not. You would only have clear conscience in front of that person if you paid him or her what you owe. Therefore, clear conscience in front of God comes through the payment that the sacrifice of Jesus Christ completed. Hebrews chapter 10 verse 1 to 2 explains this concept of having a clear conscience comes through the sacrifice of Jesus. It is saying that the sacrificial system set up in the Old Covenant was a shadow of Jesus' true sacrifice. The author was saying if the animal sacrifices were the real thing, then the worshippers would have had a clear conscience about sin, which implies that whatever the real thing is, it would clear the consciousness of sins. Therefore, we can conclude that Jesus' sacrifice clears people's consciousness of sins by paying for their sins. Moreover, if we add the fact that Abraham was credited as righteous because he believed, it shows that the time of belief is when someone is made righteous, and that righteousness is obtained for good since Jesus' sacrifice applies to all sins of a believer, past, present, and future. Hebrews 10 verse 12 says, "But when Christ has suffered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God." Now, let's go on to the next question. Why does all of this necessarily mean once saved, always saved is true? It is because a perfectly just and good judge wouldn't make someone pay for the same crime more than once. And since Jesus fully paid for all sins of a believer, The believer cannot be charged again based on any of his or her sins, past, present, or future. And we know for sure that Jesus was able to pay for our sins completely because Jesus resurrected. It is like someone going to jail and then being released. Why does a person who go to jail ever get released? It is because he fully served his sentence and all crimes that he was charged for was compensated for. Thus, Jesus walking out of that tomb shows us that he completely served the sentence that we would have had to serve ourselves. Therefore, believers cannot be judged anymore based on what was paid for already, which is all sins. That means that at the judgment, believers will have no more sins to pay for. So, this brings us to the final question. Why do believers still die if they are forgiven of all their sins? It is because the judgment will happen at the end. In the ancient Jewish culture, after a payment is made for a crime, there still has to be a formal hearing where a judge declares a person free from the crime. A formal court hearing is at the judgment where believers are saved and non believers go to their second deaths. Until then, everyone is still in due process or custody. But here's the thing, once the payment is made, even though the convicted criminal is still in due process or in custody, they have the promise legally by the law that they will be set free. And a perfectly just and good judge wouldn't go back on this principle. God Himself promises the believers the freedom at the time the payment is made, which is why believers still experience bodily death since they are still in custody. And it is only at the judgment at the end where people are pronounced free or not officially. And this ties into predestination. Once someone believes, they are predestined to be saved at the end because Jesus paid for all their sins and have the promise of God that they will be freed at the formal hearing at the end. Oh, and one more important question. Can someone freely give up their salvation after receiving it? Nope. It is because a person, after having paid for their crimes in full, cannot voluntarily receive more punishment for the crime. People on this side of eternity might be able to commit more crimes to get imprisoned again. However, in the case of salvation, Jesus paid for all possible sins that a person could commit at the time of belief. That means that there are no more new sins to commit to incur more punishment for a believer. But that doesn't mean a true believer can then live a life of sin without remorse. It is because God won't allow a heart to harden once salvation is received. Hardening of hearts is a punishment from God. It is the state of just completely and utterly ignoring one's conscience. And that is impossible for a believer because all sins have been paid for. So, in conclusion, it is convincing by looking at the scriptures and logically going where it leads that once saved, always saved is true. Even though we experience our bodily deaths, it doesn't mean that we still need to work on something to be saved. We cannot lose our salvation because we are promised salvation due to Jesus' payment for our sins, which means we cannot be charged for our sins again. And I hope that if you had some anxiety about your salvation, this will help you. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and hit the like button. Bye bye.